Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here. People always used to ask me, what do you actually do if you study politics? You end up in basements doing presentations to people interested in strange topics. I think with that we'll start and try and keep it as short as possible. The idea with this, and I must say the content not only draws on what we do at FTI, it also draws on what I done at the manufacturing circle before, and includes with their agreement some content from them and from the research that was done by Pan-African Investment Research Services. Just first off, outline of the presentation. I'm going to do a quick introduction of FTI, do some introductory remarks on the topic. We're going to look at recent economic outcomes in SA and what it means for manufacturing, changing global manufacturing landscape, and then policy and strategic agenda for manufacturing as an outflow from all of this. First, the introduction to FTI. It's a global company, 27 countries, 4,500 employees. It started in the US, but we have got branches on all continents, I think, except for Antarctica. And there's two Nobel laureates. It's a big company. If you haven't heard of it, it's there. You can just go and Google. All the representation around the world. And what we basically do, there's various streams. We help companies with finance and restructuring. We do economic consulting with regards to regulatory issues and so on. Forensic and litigation support. This area, strategic communications, is where I'm busiest, around public affairs in particular. And then there's also a technology arm. We are both in Joburg and in Cape Town. It's a BEE level 2 company. If you've got problems you think we could solve for you, please feel free to phone. Introductory remarks. So South Africa manufacturing over time has gone through a number of phases that were impacted by the development of the country. Manufacturing, like mining, developed off the back of cheap labor and electricity. Cheap labor, obviously, subsidized by the Homeland Policy. As time went on, that system obviously became unsustainable and wasn't just, and so therefore had to change. With apartheid isolation, there were a number of steps to keep the country self-sufficient. So Sasol came along, Armscor came along, and those are some of the major milestones along our industrial development. Without mining, that would not have been there to do so in the first place. So the interaction between mining and manufacturing has always been key in South Africa. The other important upstream sector for us is for manufacturing is also agriculture. And it means that the development of South African manufacturing has always taken a very particular course. So we tend to focus on manufacturing of turning raw materials into goods that people can use. Some of those processes, engineering processes, are quite sophisticated. We've built a name for our market in terms of being able to do precision work of high quality at a good price, which in the current day can still not be equaled by what is being achieved by Eastern Europeans. And we've also built, despite our history, a name for integrity. We don't reverse engineer your products. If you manufacture it here, we speak English, we are fairly easy to deal with, and despite our many labor concerns, can assure a relatively stable supply. The example that we use today is, for instance, the BMW factory. During the protracted strikes that we had in the last 2 years in the automotive and steel sector, they made Plan B, C, and D with regards to logistics, and today is regarded as the most competitive BMW plant in the world, despite that situation. So later on, of course, democracy came with certain benefits, but we liberalized the economy very quickly. That put South African manufacturers in a position where they, from being very ensconced before, now also had opportunity to export, but with that came the added competition of not having tariff protection. That liberalization happened very quickly, and it came with some challenges, which was exacerbated by the rise of China. China, of course, wanting to achieve quick growth, heavily incentivized manufacturing practices or activity, which means that they, with no equalizing measure at our borders, basically compete in our market on an unfairly incentivized basis. Along with that, there is also predatory trade practices. So this is practices like under-invoicing, exporting goods under wrong tariff codes so as not to attract tariffs and so on. So those are the kind of things that have put manufacturing under tremendous pressure. Post-2008 global financial crisis, of course, there was a drop of demand in our traditional export markets, which means that there was lower volumes for local manufacturers. Along with that came rapidly increasing administered price costs, which means that there was a tremendous squeeze on their margins. And we saw that with our super exporters. In case you didn't know, about 95% of our exports are being exported by 5% of our exporters. Those super exporters even suffered setbacks in their competitiveness with regards to new market entries and product development. Why? Because they didn't have the margins to reinvest in innovation, or chose not to do so in certain cases. So, I mean, there's a lot of stories around innovation in South Africa. Certain companies do it, prioritize, and so on, but there are many other companies in South Africa that are tremendously obsessed with immediate challenges such as labor, electricity, supply of water and electricity, and other challenges. And so the focus is not always there, and it's certainly one of the things that needs to be addressed along with some of the other challenges. So some introductory remarks. These I'm going to skip because I basically did that already. Let's go to recent economic outcomes in South Africa. So just what this is meant to demonstrate is that the performance of South Africa's economy has always remained tied to its manufacturing sector. If you go back 40 years, our manufacturing performance is a mirror of the growth performance of the country, and vice versa. If we want manufacturing to pull out from underneath the economic growth of the country, then we are going to have to do certain interventions. Those may involve looking at our administered prices. It may involve looking at our labor regime. It may involve looking at market access. Those are things that we can fix, but there are more obviously complicated things like a skills pipeline and like innovation, which requires an ecosystem that is encouraging for us to be able to do so. This slide is very complicated, but basically all it's meant to illustrate to you is that when countries that are industrialized develop, at our level of development, typically manufacturing would contribute around 40% of GDP or thereabouts, between in excess of 30% in any event. In South Africa, manufacturing has never contributed more than 22% of GDP. That was while we were a closed economy in the early 80s, and the gold price was very, very strong. So it was almost circumstances that had nothing to do with manufacturing itself that saw it perform in that way relative to other sectors of the economy. Subsequently, obviously, the gold price declined, and the rest of the economy diversified significantly, which has meant that currently manufacturing contributes around 11% of GDP, and over this period, it's been around 15.3%. That means that the manufacturing sector in South Africa is underperforming in terms of what it's supposed to do, or in terms of what it's potentially able to do. In addition to falling short by standards, international standards, South African manufacturing contribution to GDP has also been gradually declining, as I've said. Part of this is because other sectors have developed, and by the way, manufacturing increasingly in the future will lead to perhaps even more jobs in the services sector that it creates in manufacturing itself. But the importance of that manufacturing activity is that it creates a lot of stability for your downstream jobs. If you have footloose services sectors, they are more vulnerable to external issues than if you've got a domestic manufacturing base with solid takeoff. Commodities still dominate in terms of the share of total South African exports. You can see mineral products there, 24%, precious metals 21%, base metals 13%, and only then comes vehicles and machinery. Doesn't mean that those mineral exports are not important. They are important certainly because mining not only supplies to manufacturing, it's also a great source of offtake, but a greater diversification there would certainly mean that we would be less vulnerable in situations where we are now, where commodities are under significant pressure. Sub-Saharan Africa has emerged as a key destination for our exports. After the global financial crisis in 2008 especially, it has been well, thanks to markets such as Kenya, Nigeria, Angola, and so on, that we have been able to hold on to much of our manufacturing capacity in this country. Manufacturing capacity, once it's lost, takes very long to regain. So it just underlines the degree to which we need to seek closer partnerships with the rest of the continent and need to really look at integrating better with them in terms of manufacturing activity. Meanwhile, South Africa's share of global exports has lagged that of its BRICS peers. You can see that China has done great in terms of the percentage growth of their exports. South Africa is right there at the bottom, while Brazil and India has also exceeded what it has been able to achieve. Rising manufacturing unit labor cost is eroding competitiveness in South Africa, which underlines the need for many manufacturers to diversify away from that risk. That is unfortunately the situation. You can see here in terms of the slide, there's a disconnect that happened round about or just after 2007, where there's a widening gap between labor cost and productivity. It's manufacturing in general terms pay quite well for workers, and there's a lot of benefit that comes with work in manufacturing or for labor in manufacturing. It's technical skills and so on, obviously, but there's also benefits like medical aid and housing and so on that often come with it. It is, there's no manufacturer that I have met that would make an argument against paying workers fairly and increasing their pay as it is possible to do so, because you've got a more stable workforce and nobody wants to see, I think, that the people that work for you are suffering. So that is certainly there. The way to solve or the way to justify the higher costs for labor is to increase their productivity. Without that increase in productivity, it means that your business model becomes unsustainable, and that sooner or later you'll have to make a call. Either cut the number of hands on deck, drop salaries, remuneration wages, or you're going to have to close your business. With the huge amount of industrial action and interruptions that we've seen in the last couple of years, there's manufacturers that have, and this is anecdotal evidence, because we haven't been able to do a deep dive study on it. Nobody's commissioned it, so if anybody here wants to commission it, please give me a call. We have seen a number of manufacturers that have either chosen to import what they used to produce locally, to substitute certain components that they used to manufacture locally for imported components, or to close certain product lines altogether. There's a number of areas where we fare very well. The quality of our institutions, our infrastructure relative to other BRICS countries. If you've ever traveled in Brazil or India, then you would know South Africa is not such a bad place in terms of infrastructure, goods market efficiency, financial market development, business sophistication and innovation, in relation to those emerging market peers, we fare quite well. But there are other areas where we're not doing that great. The one is we're quite a small market, and we struggle when it comes to market access. Yes, we've got fairly good relationships still, despite fractious recent times, with our established export base in the Eurozone and America, but those markets haven't been faring that well post the global financial crisis and are still basically in recovery. Our emerging markets access to the rest of the markets in Africa struggles because of infrastructure, red tape, and costs. If you have to do port-to-port exports in Africa, it becomes so expensive that there are just many products that you are not able to export. And then, of course, there's tariff barriers as well. So that's an area that we need to address. Technological readiness, just around ICT, there's a lot of cost and availability questions. The labor market, it's put in very crass terms here. I don't think even in manufacturing you'll find people that will say you'll have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but certainly the regime will require adjustment if we are going to become more competitive in that area. And then, of course, health and education are areas which I think is not controversial at all. We know we struggle with that in South Africa. Then most problematic factors for South African export in 2013, high cost and delays caused by domestic transportation. This is mostly due to delays at ports, and I think in large part due to the lack of availability of rail transport. Access to imported inputs at competitive prices is difficult. I think this may be a more recent phenomenon with the weakening of the rand. Identifying potential markets and buyers, tariff barriers abroad, burdensome procedures at foreign borders, inappropriate production technology and skills. So in other words, there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to costs and when it comes to market access, when it comes to imports. There is now export promotion legislation that is being contemplated by the Department of Trade and Industry. At the end of the day, I think that piece of legislation is going to end up having to try and get some measure of coordination and coherence around some of these issues, plus provide some sort of export incentive. But it will still, at the end of the day, rely on the cooperation within government to get it properly executed. And then with regards to certain areas such as access to trade, finance, corruption at foreign borders and so on, will also depend on the cooperation of the private sector. So let's look at the changing global manufacturing landscape. Final product assembly is the most common entry point for manufacturers into the global value chain. Final product assembly makes out 79% of the activities performed by manufacturing value chains in Africa. Packaging and shipping 64%, intermediate inputs is only 58%, and then sales and marketing, etc., etc. Globally, most trade are in terms of intermediate goods. So it means that we are less connected to the rest of the world than the rest of the world are connected to the rest of the world. So there's a significant arguments in favor of, for instance, thinking in terms of factory Southern Africa, where we, like you find in the East and in Europe, spread the responsibility and look at greater specialization in the manufacture of components for finished goods. The most famous example is obviously the iPhone, where you've got different components, the camera and the, I almost said buttons, but the iPhone doesn't have buttons. Different components manufactured all over Asia and then assembled at one point at the end of it and shipped off to America. Changing global manufacturing practices, improvements in ICT and transport infrastructure have contributed to the globalization of manufacturing value chains. Outsourcing and offshoring of functions within companies' manufacturing value chains are rising. Following factors are driving this trend: containing costs and improving productivity, penetrating new markets, gaining access to strategic assets in other countries, e.g. skilled labor and technological know-how, and that's that. So just in terms of this, for instance, the argument in terms of Factory Southern Africa says, if you've got comparative advantage in a certain area, go and capitalize on that. So if you've got lower and more stable lower cost and more stable labor, say for instance in Botswana, but you've got more efficient telephony in South Africa, then you would do the labor intensive work in Botswana and you would have highly technologically advanced manufacturing activity, say for instance happening in South Africa. And it may be the same thing for sourcing raw materials, turning them into, doing low cost value addition in a certain place and then moving it on to the next for more advanced things. In terms of the changing global manufacturing practices, the concept of manufacturing is no longer understood in terms of production alone, but increasingly in terms of the various activities inside the value chain. But I think the trick with this is to understand that to make sure that you're competitive in those different areas, you need offtake at the end of the day. We, for instance, found in post the global financial crisis that the lack of investment in the lack of offtake, should I first say, which was caused by unfairly incentivized imports, and the lack of investment in rural areas was stopping local frozen chip producers to invest not so much in production plants, they had those already, but in additional rural infrastructure such as loading sites and so on, and also research and development activities. So it would be potato seed laboratories and those kind of things, which is important skills that you want to retain in the country. They were not making those investments anymore. So it's not only manufacturing that suffers. There are various other areas that involve innovation that also suffer when we don't have that offtake. In fact, distinctions between manufacturing and services are no longer clear-cut. The servitization, which is a concept that have emerged here, refers to the innovation of an organization's capability and processes to generate greater value via a shift from just selling products or manufacturing products to selling product service systems. So again, the iPhone, with that comes apps and various other products, the covers and so on that you buy with it, and various other innovations to make that one piece of technology plug into others. As such, addressing South Africa's manufacturing competitiveness stalemate and reviving the sector's performance requires taking into account and embracing the emerging global trends. The servitization of manufacturing is happening during an era characterized by creative destruction and the emergence of disruptive technologies. So this graph basically illustrates that. It illustrates on that side you've got the length, implied lifetime of S&P 500 companies. And if you look at what's happened over the last, 90 years, then you would see the average lifespan of a company has moved from 55, 75, 80 years to around 15 years. And this is a result of the quickening pace of innovation. Disruptive technology comes along. Take, for instance, Uber. It renders traditional taxi companies, in certain instances, almost irrelevant. And so the competition moves on to a different space. And now you've got more competition emerging for Uber, and as traditional taxi companies fall away. Challenging the status quo, currently in the space of manufacturing, is the advent of a number of disruptive technologies. The one is mobile internet. A simple thing like Wi-Fi has made a lot of things challenged, a lot of things that were great challenges much easier. The automation of knowledge work, the Internet of Things, which of course depends on that, and then of course cloud technology is another technology that has made things much easier. And then with this, of course, is things like additive manufacturing and so on. And the crucial thing to understand here is that these activities obviously do not or do not necessarily take work away from manual labor, but rather creates work in addition to it, in the sense that you are now able to manufacture things that were not possible to manufacture before. You can do new designs, you can do new components, and whereas some of this activity may replace some work that was done by hand before, or just normal mechanized traditional manufacturing, it also creates a lot of jobs in services and so on. But it, of course, also requires skills. Meanwhile, ICT affordability and skill stock in South Africa falls below the average of peer companies. This is, again, a graph coming from the Global Competitiveness Index, where you see where South Africa is in the blue, and we fall below our peers when it comes, or we fare worse than them when it comes to affordability, skills, individual usage, government usage. Government usage is very important when it comes to bringing in new innovations, because it creates a base for demand that allows the technology to become cheap enough so that other people can make use of it before. I can't think off the top of my head of a manufacturing example, but say for instance in education, you need to produce learning materials fairly cheaply. It's not easy to do that if the scale is small, but if you provide cheap technology and you provide takeoff in government, then the private sector and other public learning institutions can tap into that. I think the Western Cape province have recently made a huge investment in terms of both supplying cheap internet and buying e-learning materials just to provide that type of takeoff. So there's an example. In manufacturing, it may be something else, a process to manufacture medical equipment in South Africa with polypropylene, which we have in surplus. If you can introduce that new technology and private and public sector hospitals can buy it, then that technology will become very cheap. If it's one doctor that buys for his rooms, then it will be very expensive. The last bit of the presentation is a policy and strategic agenda for manufacturing. To succeed in repositioning SA manufacturing performance in a challenging global environment requires a concerted effort. In the public sector, we need to create a positive environment for the sector through strategically coherent policies and institutions. So it's things like market access, administered prices, labor, and so on, but it's also things like innovation, education, and addressing this thing of demand for innovation. I don't know if you are familiar with it, but in America and a couple of other countries, there's a program called the Small Business Innovation Research Fund, or program. And it's not a particular fund, it's basically this decree that all government departments and entities need to set aside 2.5% of their budget for innovation. So what happens is at the end of the year, the civil servants are called into a room and they are told to make a list of all the problems that they don't have solutions for. This gets basically posted somewhere or nailed to a door, and small companies are invited to pitch proposals to develop solutions. And those are eventually funded to the point that they are commercialized, which creates quite a bit of activity in terms of innovation and small business development. So that's one of the things that we can look at in South Africa. Then in the private sector, there needs to be dovetailing with government efforts, obviously. We need to provide effective on-the-job training and promoting technology-related training, proactively engage industrial policy, but also proactively innovate. And then we need the appropriate infrastructure and operational environment, which is not entirely contested ground, but the positive side of this is that there are a couple of guys in South Africa that manufacture, that find themselves in rural spaces, and who have started to creatively refer to a blank canvas environment where they are able to innovate in the space where they struggle with ICT and so on. Just some inputs from manufacturers on this. We did a bit of a survey of the sector, and they basically said that introducing manufacturing technologies will require everything that I've just mentioned on the previous slide, but it will require us to go to the extra mile. So here's 4 quotes. The one says, a lot of incentives would be required before widespread adoption of Industry 4.0 applications among South African manufacturing will happen. That does not only mean that government needs to give before somebody will invest, but providing takeoff, for instance, is one area where it's not about giving, but really where it is we want to procure something that will be for the public good, and that will provide you the volume to do the investment yourself. The second quote says, the lack of infrastructure is a key risk for success of the industrial internet in South Africa. That needs to be overcome first. I've got ADSL at my home. If I struggle, then I can only imagine how these guys must struggle. There needs to be security of supply if you are going to set up or use the Internet of Things in your factory. A lot of South African manufacturers are focused on immediate issues like labor and electricity. There is a general lack of focus on building for the future and investing in education and training, as well as R&D and innovation. Their headache is so bad they can't even contemplate going to the doctor and finding what the cause of the headache is. They just want a solution to that pain right now. That's basically what's happening there. And then the last quote, a shortage of skills should not stop, this is actually quite positive, should not stop new investments in technology. Skills will eventually catch up with industry needs, or training will happen. Right, thank you everybody. I look forward to the rest of the presentations.